And now, with permission from Spacebrony himself, we present to you A Rose is a Rose, Part 8, by Spacebrony. Promises. Rainbow Dash lay on her belly in the sand. The tide rose and fell calmly as an inner struggle consumed her. One half of her mind pulled her on, pushed her forward, toward the spring and the end of this whole mess. The other half tugged her back, urged her to return to her friends, to fly back the way she had come as fast as she could. Perhaps the sonic rainbow could convince them to return. They'd see it and follow it back to her. They could go to the spring together, just as they should have. This half of her mind tugged just as hard as the other half pulled, creating two enormous, contradictory forces that canceled each other out. So, Rainbow Dash laid on her belly in the sand. Memories began to emerge and drift around her imagination like a flurry of film strips. The running of the leaves competition with Applejack, Fluttershy yelling at a dragon, Pinkie Pie's birthday party, the pet situation, the Wonderbolt Academy, and so much more. These thoughts shuffled about unbidden, and an intense loneliness came over her. She always put on a confident exterior, and for the most part it was legitimate. Even so, it crumbled when there was no pony around to see it. Normally, this wasn't an issue, but normally, her friends were only a quick shot away. Though her friends never knew it, Rainbow had much in common with Pinkie and her occasional bouts of depression. Of course, Dash's bouts were never as bad, and they were fewer and farther between. Even so, they were always great horrible clouds looming in the distance, waiting for the moment she was alone and vulnerable. Perhaps after she lost a race, or on a day when her friends were too busy to spend time with her. In moments like these, the clouds would rapidly roll in, and clouds she couldn't easily kick away. All she needed was some attention, some recognition, an approving nod, a shoulder to lean on, some pony to boast to, in good fun, of course. Without that, and the knowledge that her friends were all dealing with the same loneliness, she could hardly function. They probably think I'm a lot tougher than I really am, she thought. They probably think I'm already there, wherever there is. The spring? What does that even look like? How will I know when I'm there? She shifted in the sand, got off her belly, and sat up. Her features shifted as well. Who am I? A pony or a mouse? I can handle this. I'm Rainbow Dash. I can clear the skies of Ponyville between a lightning strike and a thunderclap. I can fly through ghastly gorge 8 times with my eyes closed. I can get off this stupid sand and get to where I'm going, even if I don't know where or what it is. With new determination, she stood up and set off for out without hesitation, heading the same way she had been going before the clouds had swooped in and darkened her thoughts and spirits. She lifted to the sky, and even performed a simple trick or two, whipping through the air. This attempt to cheer her up only made her feel even worse, however, when she realized that there was no pony around to marvel at her talent. She finally realized just how alone she really was. At cloud level she hung in the air, head lowered. Stop your sulking, she thought. How do you expect to see them again if you can't go 10 lousy minutes without stopping and feeling sorry for yourself? Get over it, for Celestia's sake, A searing pain bit into her right wing. She gasped, and the world teetered and spun around her while wind screamed across her ears. As she fell, spiraling, one of several objects she had kept tucked under her inner wing fell with her. The ground grew larger and larger. Then she was looking up back at the sky, then at the ground again. Now a wall of green, then back at the sky. She spun and spun and could hardly breathe. The sky was Dash's domain. The air was her playground. And she was able to keep calm only due to experiences of hundreds of free falls and drops like this one. Moments before the ground took up her entire vision, she spread her wings, skillfully curving her downward spiral into an upward drift. Her heart raced as she slowed to a stop. She was accustomed to falling, but that had been far too close. After stabilizing herself and checking her wing for injuries, she peered curiously and cautiously to the ground, searching for whatever it was that had attacked her. A glimmer. She flew to the ground faster than gravity could have pulled her, halting to a stop just above the gleaming object. Yes! She shouted, her voice cracking in excitement and a hoof thrown in the air. It's a rose! Rainbow Dash, you've done it again. See, that wasn't so hard. Nothing I couldn't handle. I knew I could do this all along. I guess I follow it now? It isn't moving very fast. Am I supposed to walk on the ground next to the slowpoke? Ugh. She rolled her eyes. The shard itched its way across the grass. In the distance, the ocean murmured contentedly. At this rate, I'll be lucky to reach the spring by the time I'm old enough to join the... Her thoughts were cut off as an enormous blue bolt sheared through the noontime sky. She knew that blast. She recognized the azure color. Her eyes widened with worry. That was Rarity's flare! She must be in trouble. She prepared to blast off in the direction of her friend. Then she remembered the rose. What do I do with that thing? The worry was growing, but along with it came another emotion. One that felt odd and out of place. Relief. Rarity might be in trouble, but saving her meant seeing her, and seeing a friend was exactly what Rainbow Dash needed. The more she thought about it, however, the more she realized that seeing Rarity again, talking to her, laughing with her, would make leaving her impossible. She could worry about that later, though. The most important issue was that a friend was in danger. Her mind raced as she tried to find a way to get to Rarity without leaving or losing the rose. I can't bring that thing, she thought aloud. It's hot, and it'll keep pulling me back. Maybe if I wrap it in... She glanced at the gem in question and cut off. It was right where it had been before, but now it wasn't glowing with the same ferocity. It wasn't moving either. Cautiously, she prodded it with a hoof. It was warm to her touch. The searing heat was absent as it appeared. She tucked it under her wing, a mixture of surprise, worry, and confusion. In a powerful gust that flattened the grass below, she took off to save her friend. She flew towards the weakening streak in the sky, however. It became increasingly apparent that the more time she spent with Rarity, the harder it would be for her to leave again. Rarity was beginning to panic. When she had first realized she was trapped, she had merely been annoyed. The quicksand was an inconvenience, a sore obstacle, a bump in the road. She couldn't accept for a moment that she was in actual danger. Such things simply don't happen to ponies like her. The world could never be so cruel. Fate wouldn't allow it. She would be stuck for 20 minutes or so, then she'd squeeze her way out, or some pony would come and help her. That's how it always worked, and there would be no exception. That's what she thought 3 hours ago. Now the sand was up to her neck, and the water above it was almost to her chin. She couldn't lie to herself any longer. She was stuck, and there was no escape. Half-heartedly, she squirmed and flexed in an attempt to shift herself out of the indifferent sand, but the result was the same as always. The moment she gained a centimeter of room, the more the sand filled the gap. Ugh! In frustration, she thrust about as powerfully as she could, heaving with such force that she could muster between each word, Stupid! A heave. Son! A thrust. I don't have time to deal with this! I have friends who need me! She screamed as she sank another inch, and the tragedy of her situation finally dawned upon her. This was worse than being stuck. This was sinking. She couldn't wait until some pony rescued her. By the end of the day, there would be no pony to rescue. Only a shallow pool of muddy water with a sand floor. The world spun around her. The sand pressed in from all directions. Strangely, though, it wasn't uncomfortable. The soft sand's touch was gentle, and it fit every contour of her body perfectly. Warm and tight, like a full-body massage everywhere at once. The sensation was lulling in, would she dare to admit it? Yes, even pleasant, in an absurd kind of way. Thoughts of her regular visits to the spa laughed at her mind, and suddenly she wasn't trapped in the ground, but in a jacuzzi in Ponyville with cucumbers over her eyes and mud on her cheeks. Do be a dear and give my shoulders a rub, she said to the blue spa pony. I've been walking for days, and I haven't even had a proper bed to sleep in. She smiled. That's much better. Well, would you mind turning the heat up? The water's getting incredibly cold by my toes. She laughed as if she had just said something incredibly funny. Suddenly she remembered something. She turned to the spa pony, who was busy giving her a back massage. Could you send in my friend Fluttershy now? I've been waiting for her, and she said she would show up. This thought felt urgent, imperative, though she wasn't sure why. The spa pony looked back blankly and said nothing. Please? Rarity asked again, growing more and more concerned. Send her in. She should be right outside. The pony stared straight through Rarity, unblinking, like a deactivated robot. What kind of service am I paying here for? I want you to send my friend Fluttershy this instant! The blue pony didn't even blink. She just kept staring. It was unnerving, frightening, like she wasn't even there. Fine! I'll get to him myself! Rarity began to leave the jacuzzi, but after moving an inch, the water became thicker, like a gel. She couldn't even pull her legs to the surface. Hey, what is this? She exclaimed, surprised. Her company stared and said nothing. Don't stand there! Help me out! She had already lost hope in gaining the blue pony's attention. Instead, she turned as best she could to the curtains that led to the reception area where Fluttershy was undoubtedly waiting. Fluttershy! She shouted, Fluttershy! I'm stuck in this jacuzzi and the spawn bleeding and pulling inside the stone! Could you please help me? She stared expectantly at the curtain, but there was no response. Fluttershy? She began to panic. Fluttershy, are you there? With grunts of struggle, she turned every which way, her eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, the room itself felt sinister, like a trap that she had unknowingly sprung. The employee kept staring that stare, and the curtains remained silent. The quiet was maddening, and she was still trapped. She felt like even if she pulled the curtains back with magic, beyond them would be nothing but black emptiness. Let me go! She fought with every ounce of her strength. The thick water would not give. Except now it was thick sand, and she was no longer in the spa, but back in a wide and empty field. With a gasp, she returned to reality, but that only allowed a brief visit, because in her weariness and shock, she passed out in a comforting void of half-sleep. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Leave me alone, she mumbled. The blue pony was only staring a hole at her. Leave me alone. The palace. There's only one. What are you doing? Put me down. Let me go. Slowly and wearily she opened her eyes. She was being dragged. Strong hooves looked under her legs and were pulling her forward. She felt numb all over. The colors of the setting sun seemed pleasantly unreal, as she had escaped a harsh reality in which she was stuck in the ground to an imaginary land where she was free. However, the hoofs that dragged her felt too real. The ground beneath her felt too soft for this to be her imagination. The dragging halted, as she was gently lowered to the ground. Oh, she mumbled weakly. She smiled. Das! You saw it. You came. The blue Pegasus returned to smile, though there was a sadness in her eyes that Rarity found frightening. Daz turned around and began walking away. Wait! Rarity tried to get up, but everything below her neck felt numb and weak. She could only raise a hoof to her friend, who looked down, kept walking, and didn't turn back. Rainbow Daz, wait! Daz unfurled her wings and lifted off, gaining speed until only the trace of her was a rainbow ribbon that trailed off into the distance. Okay, that was one of the coolest scenes I've seen in a Rainbow Dash-centered fanfic in a while. Thank you, Dash. Rarity stared at the colorful trail for some time. She didn't know what she should feel. With a little effort, she finally managed to get to her hooves, though she wasn't sure she could walk yet, and if she could, she didn't care. All that was on her mind was Rainbow Dash, who had come to save her but had left so quickly. She was alone again, and she would have given all her possessions just to talk to Dash, ask where she was going, why she had left, and why she hadn't said a word. She glanced up to the fading rainbow trail one last time, and the world exploded in a burst of color. Every ounce of the spectrum flooded in the sky in complete silence. It spread from the end of Rainbow Dash's trail until the air itself seemed to glow in an alienating red and blue and green in every color. In the distance, a line of grass began bending away with the force of the sonic rainbow, growing closer and closer until it suddenly hit her. It broke the air with the sound of a rumbling wind and a breeze that felt cool and refreshing across her coat and mane. The red of the setting sun was blotted out by blue and green and orange. The grass became greener, the sky bluer, and the appearing stars twinkled not with white, but with purple, indigo, and yellow. Somehow, Rarity suddenly understood everything. She smiled into the comforting breeze, which cooled her aching body and dried her tears. Then she gasped in surprise as her pack began to thrash against her back. As Dash turned away from her friend, fury rose within her. Why? Why does it have to be this way? Wait! Rarity shouted, too weak to chase after her. Rainbow Dash, wait! Dash was absolutely heartbroken. To leave her friend weak and alone was against everything she had ever known. She felt like a betrayer, but she couldn't look back. She couldn't run to her friend and embrace her like her heart kept screaming for her to do. She could only walk on and hope that Rarity would understand that going back now would make finding the spring impossible. She spread her wings, and with a gentle puff of air, drifted up into the sky. It was all she could do to not look back. If she did, her resolve would crumble. So she flew on, the anger rising. Anger at herself for not being strong enough to stay with Rarity for just a little longer. Anger at, what was his name? Thade, that dark pony who caused this mess in the first place. Even angry at Celestia for allowing herself to be captured. As she became angrier, she flew faster and faster, pumping her wings furiously. What self-entitlement does this pony Thade have anyway? She thought bitterly. What makes him so special that he decides he can cheat death? Does he think he's the only one who's lost some ponies he cared about? Her anger translated to speed as he flapped faster and harder. And he gets to the sky and risk the balance of all life in Equestria just because he thinks he deserves more? Because he's too weak to deal with loss? Her growing fury seemed to have alarmed a part of her that saw nearly everything, as clearly as the sonic cone was beginning to form in front of her outstretched hooves. When I finally meet this Thade, I've got a thing or two to say to him, and when I'm through, he's going to need some pony to bring him back from the dead! She thought of Rarity lying weakly on the ground, adjusting a hoof for help, and saw again that look that came over her face when she realized her friend was leaving a second time. With a final grunt of righteous fury, she tore through the sound barrier, too caught up in her emotions to even notice the enormous spectacle she had created behind her. You don't know it, but we're coming for you, Thade! This has to end. That's a promise. The time was drawing near. Thade couldn't yet see the cracks in the final pillar, but he could feel them. The entire rocky cavern seemed to groan around him. It seemed as if the entire mountain was being held up by nothing more than the final pillar. He nervously twisted ear. Patience was a skill of his, or he never would have made it this far. Patience, however, could only last so long. Now it was being replaced by anxiousness. His cloak, which he already detested, became too hot. He felt like a young colt waiting nervously by the door for his first date arrive, peeking out the window every few minutes. Everything had gone so smoothly so far. Everything except the alicorn. He should have expected trouble from her. Even now, while she laid unconscious upon the altar, she worried him. She was unpredictable, an uncontrollable variable, the only force that could impede upon his presence. His only choice was to keep her perpetually paralyzed. He had to come up with a better solution, but it was only too risky to leave her awake. She had already served her part by unwillingly donating a drop or two of blood. But he couldn't release her. He was too afraid to attempt to kill her. Besides, he was not a murderer, despite his earlier threats. In fact, if anything, he considered himself the complete opposite of a murderer. He was attempting to restore life, not end it. An enormous tremble ran through the construct, and stumbled perilously to the side, scrambling again to regain his balance. A puff of rocky dust fell over him, and he instantly recognized the danger from above. He had seen the falling rock powder many times in the past few days. They signaled a shift in the structure of the hard cavern ceiling, and were almost always followed by falling rocks that had sinking loose after millennia of stability. Without thinking, he teleported himself somewhere to his left. He had so little time to react, he couldn't even specify his destination with certainty. The cavern shook once more, this time with the skull-grinding crack of rock against rock. The repercussions traveled through the stone floor like a shockwave, kicking him harshly into the air. He landed heavily on his side, gasping as the wind was knocked out of him. For several moments he lay on the ground in silence, unable to breathe or groan, capable of only wheezing painfully. The echo of the impact faded within the cavern, but he could still hear it in his head. Even after sputtering out a cough, it began to finally regain his breath. He shakily turned to the site of the collision, the very spot he had stood upon moments ago. Half embedded in the rock ground was a boulder that had almost flattened him, a spider web of fissures going out from the center. I should be more careful, he thought. Imagine coming only this far, only to be squashed like a bug. Then I wouldn't be here, and the ritual would go unfinished, and there would be no justice. The life that was taken from me, from her, would never be replaced, and that would be the greatest tragedy of them all. Then, from the depths of his mind and heart, another voice spoke. Perhaps it would have been best if you had been erased by that boulder just now. It said, the last pillar would still fall, but without the word, the spell, the ritual would never be complete. And the risk you are taking, yes, you are aware of the risk, though you pretend you are not, would never be realized. And if you were dead, you'd be there, in the next world, with her. No! He thought, his rather handsome face twisted in a ugly scowl. Tricks! Celestia's tricks! Those thoughts can't be my own. She must have implanted them in my head. There are no worlds beyond this one. There can't be. She lies unconscious upon the altar, but she must be faking. Those thoughts can't be my own. But they are. The voice continued sadly. Are you so naive? Has no part of you been left uncorrupted by grief? Think! If you don't believe in the worlds beyond this one, from where you are bringing her back, then she steps through the portal. What is on the other side? Think! But, he thought, but, no, he said aloud. Too late. I can't stop. Not after I've come this far. However, he walked back to his quarters. He was met by a revelation that stopped him in his tracks. The chamber reverberated with the sounds of his hooves against hard rock floor after he throws. Staring at the curved wall, but seeing nothing, lost in thought. The voice in my head. The thoughts were mine. But the voice was Laska's. He stood perfectly still a moment more, his expression unreadable, then ran off into his chamber. Des was exhausted, sweating and weary from what felt like hours of flying. The whole time, her thoughts had been a hurricane of worry and anger. A horrible fury. Her wings were sore, her ears hurt from the wind, and she was starving. The sun had long since shrunk behind the horizon, and the evening stars drew patterns in the sky. The reflections of these patterns were disturbed as Des drank heavily out of the clear water. She stopped drinking to clear her breath, and her reflection stared back at her intently. Her blue coat was rumpled and unkempt. Her eyes were wet, whether from crying or from the high speed of her flight, she did not know or care. She closed her eyes while she wiped them, but opened them again, when, behind her eyelids, she was greeted with an image. Rarity, hoof extended, eyes pleading, yet so thankful, when the look of confusion as Des turned away. Get over it, she thought. She's probably past that by now. And you should be too. You'll see her again, and you'll explain everything. Don't keep her waiting. Keep moving. She began to set off, but realized from experience it was better to be prepared. She opened her pack and felt around for her canteen, pulled it out, and spent several frustrating minutes finding the lid to open cover with her mouth, then plunged the island under the gently flowing tide of the river. After the bubble stopped, she capped it and put it back on her pack, but not without bumping her hoof against a familiar, hard object. She pulled out the rose and placed it on the ground before her. She stared at it expectantly for a silent moment. Well, she said, lead the way! The steam murmured behind her, and the wind whispered gently through the grass, but the fragment stayed put. Des growled with frustration. Come on! Her voice cracked on the second word. You were doing it earlier! Get moving! She nuzzed it with a hoof. It rolled onto another of his intricate edges, but otherwise remained still. You know, good job! You start moving when I need to help my friend, but you won't move again when I need you to! She chuckled defiantly. I probably could find a spring without your help anyway. She put an inferiorly immobile rose onto her pack and laced it shut. Heading out to find a spring without its help seemed like the only option. Her wings were still sore when she spread them, but she had dealt with worse before. So with a mighty, painful flap, she took to the sky. Is this really a good idea? A voice spoke out of her head. Dad still hovered in the air, considering. You can't fight it without the rose. You'll only cause trouble for yourself. The voice was Twilight's. Think of what happened to Rarity. What if something similar happens to you? Except you can't send out a magic flare, and even if you could, who would see it? I agree, spoke another familiar voice. Bad idea. Wait for the ruse. That's what I did when I got lost. He'll look for you, too. Yes, Fluttershy added. What Applejack said. Don't end up like me, Rarity warned. Hey, it sure is echoing in here in your head, Rainbow Dash. Pinky said, hello. Echo. Oh, it don't go off without the road. Please, Dashie, we need you. Please don't. Dash lowered herself to the ground. They had only been voices in her head, but they felt so real. Like her friends had actually were right beside her instead of somewhere miles away on this strange far-off land. She began to thinking of them, each of them, and was so lost in memories and emotions that she didn't notice the gentle thumping of her pack against her side. She shook her head, clearing it of times long past, and the last to pack. She peered inside and grinned. He was close, and he knew it. The book he sought, the book with the answers, was almost within his grasp. Supernaturals. How long has it been since he had last held that book? A decade? In the mirror, his reflection stared back at him. Soon, he said to himself. Then he noticed something peculiar. His eyebrows rose in surprise. It must have been his imagination. What he was seeing was not possible. He stood up and got a closer look. No, he said incredulous. That can't happen. That doesn't ever happen! He stared fearfully at his reflection, then rotated before the mirror. That's not possible! From that day forth, he never removed his cloak, lest he see his own reflection and become reminded of a change within himself he could never accept. Fluttershy couldn't help but remember her previous experience with the mountains, when she and her friends had traveled together to evict the smoke-emitting dragon that plagued Ponyville and the surrounding areas. She had been terrified of dragons, terrified of heights, terrified of all the other terrifying things that took place in mountain ranges, like avalanches, freezing cold, and thin, nearly unbreathable air. In the end, however, she had confronted her fears to protect her friends. Now she was alone, with no friends to protect, and every 5-inch gap in the ground seemed a mile wide. Every fall seemed to be 1,000,000 feet down, and every howl of wind seemed to be the roar of some nearby monstrosity. Despite this, the rose continued, and so did she. With a gentle hiss, it pushed across the snowy ground, seemingly floated across the white fluff, for it was so hot that the snow around it was instantly vaporized, creating a warm, easily traversable path for its lone follower. Fluttershy found its presence comforting. When she saw it, she saw her mother, and through her mother, she saw her father. And though she had hardly known him, she felt like he was watching over her. In the rose, she also saw her friends. It was split into 6 ways among them, 6 parts of a whole. Separated for now, but not forever. She felt safety in its warm glow, protection in its persevering journey. The deathly cold and the fierce altitude hardly touched her in its presence. So she carried on. Every once in a while she would become tired, and perhaps sensing this, the fragment would slow nearly to a stop. Then she'd beat off again, the wind howling, but somehow not biting her. The cold everywhere, but somehow not chilling her. Eventually, she found herself walking along a narrow ridge, and when she looked down, she nearly fell over for dizziness. She was no longer traveling near mountains. Now she was finally in the mountains. The pine trees far below, like thick green grass. Onward still. After several more minutes of ascending along the path that was not truly a path, the rose stopped. Fluttershy watched it curiously as it remained still, glowing but no longer moving. It had stopped suddenly and jarringly, as if it had run into a wall. She looked around. Mountain to her right, widening ridge beneath her, open hair, and deadly fall to her left. Applejack had given her a slight idea as to the appearance of the spring, but clearly it was nowhere near here. The sudden stillness of the rose worried her. She wasn't sure why, but it always seemed confident, like it knew exactly what to do and would never lead her astray. Now it seemed unsure, confused, almost. Fluttershy stared, distressed. Then the world became red, the snow became maroon, and the mountain became ruby, and the air violet carmine. It crept along every surface, so that even the shadows stood out in terrifying relief. She turned fearfully, afraid but determined to find the source. An enormous tower of red light ascended to the sky. Every inch of the giant monolith was cracking with arcs of maroon, crimson, and blood red. The howling wind began to scream. Where the beam met the sky, the clouds swirled around it as if trying to avoid touching this impostor of their celestial heaven. Fluttershy watched in terrifying awe, her face glowing slightly from the intense luminosity of the red pillar. The air around her felt charged, energized beyond its natural capabilities.
This must have been what Applejack was talking about, she thought. When she was lost and saw a beam, that must have been the same thing.
The earth began to shake. Fluttershy shrieked and reached blindly for the rocky slope to her right, groping for a crevice to grasp and trying not to think about the dizzying drop to her left. She found a hold. The earth trembled once more. The thunderous stone smashing against stone rumbled past her as rock above broke loose and tumbled down the mountain on both sides of her precarious grip. She shut her eyes tightly and waited for it all to be over. Is this really happening? Am I really about to do this? His earlier thoughts, though spoken in Alaska's voice, had opened a new door of perspective, a new outlook. With the conclusion of his journey rapidly nearing, implications that he never considered before were forced to his attention, and details that deemed unimportant now seemed essential. The point of no return was at hand, and a decision, the decision, had to be made. Once the portal opened, she would have to step through. Thea was certain that it was not close until a transfer took place. Before now, he had been closed-minded, unseeing, bent on his one and only objective. With her so near, however, he became obsessed with her free will, her choice, her decision. What he felt for her was love. He knew this for a fact. Love, not infatuation, not obsession, and not a false crush. Celestia might not believe it, but he truly loved her, and nothing would ruin him, break his spirits, and crush his hopes more than she hated him for bringing her back. So with deep deliberation, he asked himself, would she want him to come back? Of course she would want to come back. Why wouldn't she want to come back? Who would choose death over life? That day in Silenzo, I remembered what she had asked me before she slipped away. I remember the way she looked across the field as she said it, until her eyes met mine. The memory enveloped him, drew him in until it wasn't a stone he was staring at, but an endless field of growing crimson and green. And there she was, across from him, just as it always was, with a feather on her right wing bently slightly out of place in a way Thade found beautiful. The memory was the same this time as it had been the first 1,000 times.
We can come back sometime, can't we?
Thade smiled reassuringly.
Definitely. Do you promise?
Of course.
Do you promise? Do you promise? Promise. Promise.
Applejack had seen this before. The red beam, the swirling clouds. Another pillar had fallen. Something was different this time. Something was worse. The last time she had seen this awful phenomena, the rose fragment had begun to move. Now the opposite happened, and her fragment lay motionless. The beam was larger, brighter, louder. Instead of fading, like the first one she saw, it seemed to be growing stronger. A creaking from above. She looked up in time to jump out of the way. A tree had lighted from where it stood. Then it burst into flame, the heat nipping at her astounded face. One moment it was a fallen tree. The next it was an inferno. Oh no, Applejack thought. It was all she could think. Oh no, no, we're too late. Oh no! The creaking sound began. like a sorrowful wail. Then again, and again, and again. Trees fell behind her, before her, along the side of a neighboring mountain, down before the tree line ended. Row after row fell, like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Then each and every one burst into flame. It began to hail. Applejack found cover underneath the burnt trunk of a tree that had fallen before her. The fire had burnt out unnaturally fast, leaving a blackened husk of a tree. From underneath its safety, she listened to the thuds of hailfall, watched the beam grow brighter, and hoped that her friends were all right. So this is it, then. They thought. The fire pillar was a crumbled pile of ancient stone, glowing faintly and dimming by the second. The cavern was in a state of constant rumbling, and the chatter of falling pebbles carried on incessantly. Celestia laid on the altar, unconscious as ever. With the last pillar gone, the structure holding the worlds together, but also holding them apart, was destroyed. Every universe was in freefall, all tumbling down to the bottom where, for one short moment, they would intersect. That was the moment the portal would appear. After that moment, the worlds, untangible as they are, simply passed through each other. After that, Thane wasn't sure what would happen, and he didn't care. He'd have her back as she'd look him in the eyes and tell him she forgave him, that it wasn't his fault, that she still loved him. The rest of the world could burn or rot. That was all he needed to hear. She spoke in his mind.
Would I want to live in a world that was burning and rotting?
If you love me as half as much as I love you, he thought, the world wouldn't matter. He approached the altar where Celestia lay. Placing both hooves upon her, he closed his eyes in concentration. For a moment his horn glowed, and the alicorn glowed the same dark hue, a faint shimmer of light, a low hum. Then it was over. The altar lay bare, with nothing but a stray white wing feather to indicate that the sun goddess had been held captive there. Supposedly, teleportation was impossible to and from the spring. But with the pillars gone, they could finally access that endless store of magic, that bottomless well of strength. Setting her off had been easy, like blinking. He felt like he could teleport an entire city, summon a hurricane, turn back time. He knew better, though. Becoming a power hungry was fool's game. His intent was more precise and more personal. And now, the one thorn in his side was gone. I hope I sent her near enough to cancel that. It'd be a shame if something had happened to her, and Laska and I could never enjoy another sunrise. The last pillar had fallen. The spring's powers were beginning to course through him, and there was nothing Celestia could possibly do to stop him. He had no fear freeing her. You're contradicting yourself, Thane.
You said the world could rot, and now you say you want to enjoy a sunrise with me? You have no idea what you're doing. No clue what might happen now that the pillars are gone. What happened to you?
You're not really her, he said aloud. You're just the voice of my fears. Somebody very dear to me once told me to fight my battles. Consider this a battle I'm about to win. With Celestia gone, there was only one task, a final step, and the portal would open. All he had to do was say one word. He checked to ensure the relic was still in the bowl. Indeed, the feather, the piece from her, from the first day he met her, was right where he had put it. He looked around, examining the scene. The pillars were dust. The altar glowed brightly, infused with the power of the immortal's blood. The gray feather that he had saved so many years ago was in the bowl, which was eye level and attached to a small column. He adjusted his cloak, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes. In the darkness, he saw her as she had been when they were young, innocent, and in love in the field of roses.
Do you promise?
He closed his eyes, took a breath, then said the word.
Oh, this chapter. One thing I gotta admit, this guy does do a good rainbow dash. I mean, not as excellent as, say, Trinary, but he is getting the finer points of Rainbow Dash's personality. That for all of Rainbow Dash's egotism, bragging, she still needs that audience, because alone, she doesn't always believe her own hype. She doesn't believe her own skills and that she truly is as awesome. She sometimes does need that little reassurance. She does need that little bit of oomph to let her know. She does have a strong will, and she does have a strong ego. but sometimes even the strongest of us can fail. I also love the fact that Rainbow saves Rarity, and that scene was kind of awesome in its way. Like, showing that, yes, Rainbow knew that what needed to be done, but she wasn't so sure she could do it. Neither could Rarity, and neither could any of the others. And I like that the author picked Rainbow Dash to have this little moment of crisis. Actually, now that I think about it, the two ponies that seem to have the hardest crisis on this fic about their little mission are Applejack and Rainbow Dash. And it makes sense. Applejack is honesty. She needs to put her trust in other ponies. But she also fears losing that trust, losing them. She wants to remain honest to herself that, yes, the others will be alright, but she has to make sure. It's who she is. She has to protect. She has to be their pillar of strength. Rainbow Dash, on the other hand, is of course loyalty. She couldn't abandon them, and the idea of separating from them at a time like this, when they all need to be together, and they know that their strength lies within each other, well, that's got to be one of the hardest things for our Blue Pegasus to do. And as for Thade, his character is building up, and I like that. These flashbacks give us insight. These background stories give us who he is. Not nearly as developed as, say, as Checker or Quarry, but we're seeing more of him. And you want to know what this whole entire thing he's got going on with his obsession and the fact that he doesn't think he's wrong is making me think of? Dr. Doom. Now, it says that all the great villains think that they're doing right, and he is. He's thinking he's doing right. However, we're seeing what obsessing can do. And another way, this is making me think of one of my favorite Magical Girl series, Magic Knight Rayearth. In that manga, there was this princess called Esmeralda. And she had fallen in love with the captain of her royal guard, but she had to be the pillar of her world. She had to protect it. She had to be the guardian of it all. And she couldn't fall in love. So she became so obsessed with him, so focused, that it drove her crazy. Turned her into this living monster, to the point where our girls had to fight and kill her at the end. That's what I'm loving here. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and this fic is showing it. Thane wants to save him, and if I may quote Captain America when it comes to Doom, and any other time, I would help him. But he's going about this all wrong. His obsession has driven him crazy, and even if he doesn't know it. Well, much like the last time, I'm going to do 2 chapters today on 2 separate videos. That's right, we're about to do the finale next time. Brace yourselves, it's gonna be awesome! And at 9 chapters, I would like to announce that this is probably, that outside of anything I've ever done for the Ludiverse, this is probably the shortest fic I've ever done. Don't expect it to happen too often, people.